Hello, this is Dr. Esmacher, and today we're going to be talking about the American West, particularly during the period between the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the end of the 19th century in the year 1900. So today we're going to be talking about the West as a concept, as a place, and we'll be talking about the rising conflict we see in the West as we see the expansion of settlers into the regions west of the Mississippi and the conflict they get into with the existing inhabitants of this area of the West, various groups of Native Americans. So, when we talk about American history, one of the really important concepts of American history is this frontier. The frontier is both a physical place but also an idea. When we talk about the frontier as a physical place, this is a place that is on the edge between what is settled, what is unsettled, what is known, what is unknown. Okay, so the frontier represents this kind of in between space. In terms of a concept, an idea, frontier is a really important idea within American history. And the idea of the frontier and its centrality to American history really gets explored in more detail in 1893 with a historian by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner, who has an essay called The Significance of the Frontier in American History, which he publishes that year. So Turner argues that the frontier has existed throughout American history. That has been a constant from the arrival of the first European settlers to North America until the time period that Turner is writing in the early 1890s. There's always been a frontier of the United States and what was before it the colonies that became the United States. And he argues that that frontier is central to the development of American identity because it serves as what he calls a release valve. So, in other words, if the population becomes too crowded in settled areas or people are facing declining economic opportunities in these settled areas, the solution is always go west. So go to the frontier, go and reinvent yourself in this new space. So this becomes essentially a really important function to keep American society relatively stable and free from conflict, because the solution is if you're down on your luck or you don't have opportunities to go and remake yourself in this area of frontier. And the United States was not necessarily unique in this notion of going west and remaking yourself. We see throughout the 1800s this movement of peoples across to the global west, many people leaving Europe and settling in the Americas, for example. We also see a similar pattern of westward moving settlement across Australia during the same time period, and also very similar conflicts between indigenous people and these white settlers. So the United States is very much part of this global movement of people across to the West. And Turner made the argument that without the frontier, this raises a central question about American identity, right? What happens when the frontier no longer ceases no longer exists? What happens when it ceases to exist? And it's important to note when we're talking about the United States during the period of the late 1800s, there is very much a connection between the industrialized, established economy in the eastern part of the United States and this frontier in the West, particularly the development of technology, both in communication and transportation, the creation of national economic markets made possible by advances in communication and transportation, gave Americans both the tools necessary to be able to expand, but also plugged the Western area in to the national marketplace. So it's one thing to tell somebody to go west and establish themselves as a farmer. It's another thing to be able to connect that farmer to a national market and give them more places to sell their products. So, what we're going to see is that the technology made possible by the Second Industrial Revolution helps to accelerate the movement west far, far faster than it had ever done in American history. So, we're going to see a very rapid settlement of the West during this time period, to the point where in the late 1890s, Turner and others will declare that there is no longer any frontier in the West at all.